So I've looked very broadly and quite specifically at certain words in a question so far. But remember that the first thing you need to do when you start to structure your essay and you start to think about ways in which you collate the evidence and do your reading in order to answer the essay is you need to think about what is the question actually asking me in the first place. And actually, it sounds very obvious, but in the Cambridge mark scheme, there were three main components, and you got awarded marks for answering the question. And in fact, many people lost marks or couldn't get past the 2-1 category. So between 60 to 70%, they couldn't get into the first category, over 70%, because they weren't answering what the question wanted them to do. And remember, the examiner's reading this is going to be reading a ton of essays. So you want to make sure you're very clearly addressing the question and answering what they want you to do, but bring your own personal flair to the question. And I think that links to, like a unique response, but also links to what I was saying about creating a certain kind of sophistication in the answer through writing something that you want to write about rather than regurgitating what other people have been saying. So, in regards to this question, there are two why statements. So, there are two assumptions actually within the question. Why was sustained economic growth so rare before the late 18th century? And why did this change? So, you need to answer this almost as if there are two factors in the question, two causational hinge points in a question that you need to answer. So in fact, I would get out a sheet of paper, like an A4 paper, and say economic in one circle, right? Economic growth rare before late 18th century. Other side say economic growth increased after the 18th century. And point out, make like a spider diagram and say economic growth, for example, might have been rare before the later 18th century because there was less trade routes between certain continents. And then the other side, point out examples saying it changed because of this. So you can see, for example, that could be one thread that you could look at, the growth of international maritime trade after the later 18th century that connected countries and continents together in a way that hadn't existed before the later 18th century. But in fact, you might find that, for example, sustained economic growth being rare in some parts of the world was not actually linked to the reasons why in these parts of the world economic growth became increased. So in fact, there might be two separate factors. And it's a little hard to explain, so feel free to make notes or rewind the video at this point. But for example, you might find that in pre-colonial Africa, for example, which was different to feudal Europe, pre-colonial Africa had an interesting population structure because there was a lot of land which had a significantly lower population density than feudal Europe. And I don't think that economic growth in Africa, so this was one of the reasons why sustained economic growth was more difficult in pre-colonial Africa before the later 18th century. But even after the European colonization of Africa, population density didn't change, right? Like economic growth increased in that part of the world because of colonial invasion, because they exploited the workers, they exploited the people in the country to create more economic investment, more economic output. And at the same time, this links back to what economic growth is. Is economic growth measured in terms of GDP, or is economic growth measured in terms of how much money can be extracted out of a certain place?